You've probably heard the legend of Percy Fawcett and his cursed expedition to find the lost city of Z. The lost city of Z is a mystery, but the real story is how exploration became a vehicle for displacement, disease, and violence. But every time someone tells this story, they leave out the most important part. They don't tell you about the real destruction that happened. Throughout history, explorers carried deadly pathogens that devastated indigenous populations on contact. The violence was built into the very system of exploration itself. You'll hear the fabled curse, and then you'll hear what the real curse looked like on the ground. But first, we need to understand the man behind the legend. What kind of man abandons his family to chase legends in one of the world's most dangerous places? Percy Fawcett wasn't born a monster. He was born into a system that made monsters. In Victorian England, the perfect gentleman was someone who could map unknown territories, claim them for the empire, and come home with stories of conquest. Fawcett fit this mold perfectly. He was a military officer with surveying and cartographic training, skills that taught him to see the world through imperial eyes. Every mountain, every river, every indigenous community was something to be measured, catalogued, and controlled. The Royal Geographical Society became Fawcett's gateway to greatness. This wasn't just a club for map lovers. It was the nerve center of British expansion. The society gave explorers money, recognition, and most dangerously, a sense of divine purpose. They told men like Fawcett that exploration was noble work, that claiming territories for the empire was a service to civilization. The society's marble halls were filled with portraits of heroes who had planted British flags in foreign soil. Fawcett wanted his portrait on those walls. But something changed when Fawcett first set foot in the Amazon. He arrived in Bolivia and Brazil as a dutiful surveyor, sent to map borders between countries. His job was simple: draw lines on paper, mark rivers and mountains, write reports. Instead, he found something that would consume him. The indigenous people he encountered told stories of ancient cities hidden deep in the jungle, cities filled with gold and lost knowledge, cities that no European had ever seen. Most men would have filed these stories away as interesting folklore. Fawcett became obsessed. The colonial mindset that had shaped him since childhood made these stories irresistible. Here was the ultimate prize: an entire civilization to discover, claim, and exploit. This broader imperial logic turned indigenous knowledge into raw data to be collected. The people who told him these stories weren't seen as the guardians of their own history. They were sources of information to be extracted. Their warnings about the dangers of the deep jungle weren't wisdom to be respected. They were obstacles to be overcome. The transformation was gradual but complete. Fawcett's early reports to the Royal Geographical Society show a professional surveyor doing his job. His later writings reveal a man consumed by visions of glory. He began to see himself not as a mapmaker, but as the discoverer of the greatest archaeological find in history. The lost city of Z, as he called it, became more real to him than his own family back in England. Fawcett's military background gave him the tools for his obsession, but also its most dangerous elements. His training had taught him to command men and navigate hostile territory. But it had also taught him that indigenous peoples were obstacles to be managed, not humans with their own rights and knowledge. His hierarchical military thinking made him believe that his European training automatically made him superior to any local wisdom. Even his early Amazon expeditions showed warning signs. Violence against indigenous communities was already part of his standard operating procedure. Ecological destruction followed in his wake. He saw the jungle not as a living ecosystem, but as a barrier between him and his prize. The people who lived there weren't inhabitants to be respected, but problems to be solved. Fawcett wasn't just an individual adventurer, driven by personal ambition. He was a product of a system designed to extract wealth at any human cost. The Royal Geographical Society, the British military, Victorian explorer culture, they all worked together to create men like him, men who could justify any level of destruction in pursuit of imperial glory. This imperial mindset would drive him toward his ultimate obsession: a city that existed somewhere between legend and reality, a prize that would justify any sacrifice. Why would a rational military man risk everything for a city that might not even exist? The lost city of Z wasn't just another treasure hunt for Fawcett. It was the ultimate prize in the colonial game of discovery and prestige. Finding a lost civilization meant more than gold. It meant your name carved in marble, your portrait hanging next to the greatest explorers in history. The Royal Geographical Society would celebrate you forever. The British Empire would gain another victory. This wasn't about money. This was about becoming a legend. The obsession started with stories. Indigenous people told Fawcett about ancient cities hidden deep in the jungle, cities with stone buildings and golden treasures, cities that their ancestors remembered but outsiders had never seen. These weren't just tales around a fire. They were detailed accounts passed down through generations. But Fawcett heard something else in these stories. He heard opportunity. He pointed to documents and local accounts that he took as confirmation. Victorian-era exploration mixed scientific curiosity with economic and political interests, turning every lead into potential imperial advantage. The colonial context made these stories irresistible. Discovering lost civilizations meant claiming them for European empires and personal glory. The logic was simple. If Europeans found it first, they owned it. Never mind that indigenous communities had known about these places for centuries. Never mind that people still lived there. Colonial thinking turned discovery into conquest. The moment a European explorer set foot somewhere, it became European territory. This mindset transformed every expedition into a race for territorial expansion. Fawcett's search for Z became a consuming passion that blinded him to mounting evidence of danger. Indigenous warnings fell on deaf ears. Reports of hostile tribes were dismissed as obstacles to overcome. Stories of diseases and deadly wildlife became challenges that proved his worthiness. The more dangerous the expedition seemed, the more glorious success would be. This was the explorer mentality at its most dangerous. Risk wasn't something to avoid. Risk was something to embrace. The promise of ancient gold and artifacts made explorers forget that thriving indigenous communities already inhabited these lands. They saw empty wilderness, where complex societies actually existed. They imagined dead civilizations, where living cultures continued to flourish. The focus on material wealth erased the value of existing cultures. Indigenous knowledge became irrelevant. Indigenous rights became invisible. The only thing that mattered was finding treasure that could be claimed for European empires. Economic pressures drove the treasure hunting industry. Expeditions needed wealthy backers who expected substantial returns on their investments. These financiers didn't care about scientific discovery or cultural understanding. They wanted artifacts they could sell. They wanted territories they could exploit. They wanted profits that justified their risk. This created enormous pressure on explorers to find something valuable. Failure meant no funding for future expeditions. Success meant unlimited resources for even grander adventures. Fawcett's growing obsession began to isolate him from family and colleagues who saw the dangers he ignored. His wife begged him to stay home. His military superiors questioned his judgment. Fellow explorers warned him about the risks. But Fawcett had crossed a line where criticism only strengthened his resolve. Every warning became proof that others lacked his vision. Every concern became evidence that he alone understood the true value of his quest. This isolation made him more vulnerable to the very dangers everyone tried to warn him about. The lost city of Z represented everything wrong with colonial exploration. The erasure of living cultures in favor of dead civilizations. The prioritization of imagined wealth over human lives. The transformation of indigenous knowledge into European property. Colonial explorers like Fawcett didn't see themselves as invaders. They saw themselves as discoverers. They didn't recognize the violence in their actions. They called it progress. They didn't acknowledge the destruction they caused. They called it civilization. He convinced himself the jungle held proof. That conviction would cost him everything. In 1925, 3 men walked into the Amazon jungle and vanished without a trace. But what really happened in those final weeks? Percy Fawcett had finally assembled his dream team for the expedition that would make him famous forever. His son Jack, 21 years old, and eager to prove himself. Raleigh Rymel, Jack's best friend, drawn by promises of adventure and glory. This wasn't just another mapping expedition. This was Fawcett's chance to find the lost city of Z and claim his place in history. But he was leading his own son into one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The planning for this expedition revealed Fawcett's fatal arrogance. He set out with limited provisions and made choices that left the party vulnerable, decisions that later investigations flagged as dangerous. No backup plans, no emergency provisions, no communication equipment beyond what they could carry. Fawcett believed his experience and determination would overcome any obstacle. His imperial confidence blinded him to the mounting risks that threatened all three lives. Fawcett dismissed warnings from local indigenous communities with the casual racism that defined colonial exploration. Groups who knew the territory tried to warn him about the dangers ahead. They described hostile territories, deadly diseases, and the impossibility of surviving without proper knowledge of the land. Fawcett heard these warnings as proof of indigenous inferiority. He believed European training automatically made him superior to any local wisdom. This imperial arrogance would cost all three men their lives. The environment they entered was actively trying to kill them. The Mato Grosso region was a maze of dense rainforest, swamps, and rivers that could swallow expeditions whole. Disease-carrying insects swarmed constantly. Malaria, yellow fever, and dozens of other illnesses waited in every bite. Jaguars, venomous snakes, and caimans hunted in the shadows. The heat and humidity drained strength from even the strongest men. Fresh water was scarce. Food was scarcer. Every step forward was a battle for survival. But the deadliest threat was human. Indigenous groups defending their territory from invaders had good reason to be hostile. Explorers brought diseases that killed entire communities. They disrupted hunting grounds and sacred sites. They took resources and gave nothing back. They treated indigenous people as obstacles rather than humans. The expedition's very presence was an act of colonial violence. Every mile they traveled deeper into the jungle was another mile of invasion into lands that belonged to others. Contact historically carried pathogens that indigenous populations lacked immunity to, a tragic consequence of many such incursions. What looked like empty wilderness to colonial eyes was actually home to complex societies that had lived there for thousands of years. European diseases had devastated indigenous communities across the Americas for centuries. This pattern of biological catastrophe followed explorers wherever they went. This wasn't exploration. This was the continuation of a deadly historical cycle. The last communications from the expedition arrived in May 1925. The messages revealed growing desperation and dwindling supplies. Jack and Rymel were already showing signs of exhaustion and illness. But Fawcett remained obsessed with finding his lost city. Even as their situation became desperate, he pushed deeper into the jungle. His final messages still spoke of discovery and glory. He couldn't see that his obsession was killing them all. Then came the silence. No distress signals, no desperate pleas for rescue, no bodies ever found. The three men simply vanished into the green hell of the Amazon. For months, then years, the world waited for news. None came. The jungle had swallowed them completely. This wasn't mysterious bad luck or supernatural curses. This was the predictable result of colonial arrogance, meeting indigenous resistance and environmental reality. Fawcett had ignored every warning, dismissed every piece of local knowledge, and refused every offer of help. He believed European superiority could overcome any obstacle. The Amazon proved him fatally wrong. But their disappearance was only the beginning. What happened next would transform a colonial disaster into something far more dangerous. News of the vanished expedition reached London like wildfire, and the press transformed colonial disaster into romantic adventure. Headlines screamed about brave explorers lost in mysterious jungles. Newspapers painted pictures of heroic men facing unknown dangers for the glory of discovery. The reality of imperial violence disappeared behind romantic tales of adventure and mystery. The public devoured these stories. Victorian England was hungry for heroes. The empire needed narratives that made colonial expansion look noble and exciting. Fawcett's disappearance gave them exactly what they wanted: a mystery wrapped in jungle fog, a brave father and son facing the unknown together, ancient cities waiting to be discovered. The brutal truth about diseases spread to indigenous communities became background noise. The violence against native peoples became invisible. But Fawcett's obsession kept killing long after his disappearance. Search parties multiplied the harm, with several people losing their lives in rescue attempts that stretched across decades. Each new wave of visitors risked further harm, introducing illness, disrupting life, and escalating conflict. Each search party brought more disruption to hunting grounds and sacred sites. Each group of treasure hunters carried more violence into the Amazon. Fawcett's deadly obsession had become a plague that infected everyone who heard his story. Popular culture transformed Fawcett from a colonial destroyer into a romantic hero. Books erased the violence from his expeditions. Movies ignored the indigenous people he displaced. Adventure stories focused on his courage and determination. While forgetting the communities that tried to warn him, they overlooked the ecological destruction he caused. The Royal Geographical Society and similar institutions celebrated explorers with marble portraits and golden medals, turning systematic violence into noble achievement. Colonial exploitation looked like heroic exploration. The curse narrative emerged as the perfect way to explain failure without confronting colonial violence. Why did the expedition fail? A mysterious jungle curse. Why did so many rescue parties struggle? Ancient spirits protecting lost treasure. Why couldn't anyone find the lost city of Z? Supernatural forces beyond human understanding. This cursed story let everyone avoid the real truth. Colonial arrogance had met indigenous resistance and environmental reality. No magic needed. These romanticized stories served a darker purpose. They justified continued exploration and exploitation by framing indigenous resistance as supernatural forces. When native peoples defended their territory, the stories called it a curse. When diseases killed explorers, the tales blamed ancient magic. When the jungle fought back against invasion, the legends spoke of protective spirits. This narrative made indigenous peoples seem like mystical obstacles, instead of human beings defending their homes. The search for Fawcett became another form of colonial intrusion. Every rescue expedition was another invasion. Every search party carried potential new illnesses into vulnerable populations. Every treasure hunter brought more violence and destruction. The communities that had tried to save Fawcett from his own arrogance now suffered decades of additional harm from people looking for him. The legend of the lost city of Z attracted more treasure hunters who perpetuated cycles of violence and exploitation. Adventure seekers read the romanticized stories and decided to try their luck. Treasure hunters heard about ancient gold and organized their own expeditions. Each new group brought the same colonial arrogance that had killed Fawcett. Each new invasion caused more damage to indigenous communities and fragile ecosystems. This romantic mythology obscured the true costs of exploration that continue to this day. While the world celebrated Fawcett as a tragic hero, indigenous communities in the Amazon kept suffering from the legacy of colonial violence. The real story wasn't about brave explorers facing mysterious curses. It was about systematic destruction disguised as noble adventure. The legend protected the colonial system by making its violence invisible, and yet the world kept telling the same story: a curse. But what if the curse was something else entirely? The systematic destruction that followed every colonial expedition was the true curse. Not supernatural forces, but biological, ecological, and cultural devastation on an unimaginable scale. The real curse wasn't ancient spirits protecting lost cities. It was the biological warfare that explorers carried in their blood and breath. Every European who stepped into the Americas brought death with them. Not intentionally, but inevitably. Smallpox, measles, chickenpox, and dozens of other diseases that had killed millions in Europe now found fresh victims in indigenous communities that had no immunity. Historians estimate that some regions saw population drops measured in the tens of millions after early contact. That's not exploration, that's genocide. Even unknowing explorers became vectors of devastation. Their arrival often preceded catastrophic epidemics and ecological disruption. They didn't need guns or armies to devastate entire civilizations. They just needed to breathe, to touch, to exist in indigenous spaces. The diseases they carried moved faster than they did. Smallpox could wipe out entire villages before the explorers even arrived. Communities that had thrived for thousands of years disappeared in months. Children died in their mothers' arms. Elders who held centuries of knowledge died before they could pass it on. Entire languages vanished with their last speakers. But disease was just the beginning of the destruction. Explorers opened the routes for animals, crops, and pathogens, horses, cattle, and plants that radically altered ecosystems and economies. The Columbian Exchange transformed entire continents through the movement of plants, animals, and ecosystems. European explorers brought horses, cattle, and pigs that revolutionized American landscapes. These animals trampled native plants. They competed with local wildlife for resources. They changed the soil composition and water systems. What looked like progress to European eyes was ecological disaster for indigenous communities who had lived in balance with their environment for millennia. The environmental devastation opened paths for further exploitation that continue today. Old world crops like sugar, coffee, wheat, and barley provided export commodities that fueled colonial economies. These weren't just new foods. They were economic weapons that transformed indigenous lands into European profit centers. Traditional hunting grounds became cattle ranches. Sacred forests became sugar plantations. River systems were diverted to irrigate European crops. The land itself became a commodity to be bought, sold, and exploited. The search for lost civilizations erased living indigenous cultures and knowledge systems that had survived for thousands of years. Explorers like Fawcett weren't interested in the complex societies they encountered. They wanted dead cities they could claim. They ignored the sophisticated agricultural systems, astronomical knowledge, and medical practices of living communities. They dismissed indigenous architecture, art, and spiritual practices as primitive obstacles to overcome. The prioritization of European interests over indigenous lives was built into every expedition. Cultural destruction followed economic exploitation with devastating efficiency. Spanish missions forced indigenous populations to adopt European customs, dress, architecture, and social structures. Traditional languages were forbidden. Spiritual practices were banned. Children were separated from their families to be raised in European ways. Monogamous marriage replaced traditional relationship structures. Indigenous knowledge about medicine, astronomy, and agriculture was lost when the people who held it were forced to abandon their cultures. The exploitation of indigenous labor through forced labor systems killed millions more people beyond what disease accomplished. The Spanish seized indigenous peoples as slaves and forced them to work in mines, plantations, and construction projects. These weren't jobs, they were death sentences. Workers died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and brutal working conditions. Families were torn apart. Communities were emptied of their strongest members. Traditional economies collapsed when entire populations were forced into European labor systems. This systematic destruction was not accidental. It was built into the very logic of colonial exploration. European powers needed resources to fuel their expansion. They needed land for their growing populations. They needed labor for their economic projects. Indigenous peoples weren't seen as humans with rights. They were obstacles to overcome or resources to exploit. The colonial system turned human curiosity into an engine of destruction that consumed entire civilizations. Seen this way, the mystery of Fawcett's disappearance is dwarfed by the larger, ongoing catastrophe that exploration unleashed. This legacy continues to impact indigenous communities, who still fight against the same colonial systems. And yet somehow, we keep telling the same stories. The myths persist because they serve a purpose beyond entertainment. Walk into any bookstore today. You'll find shelves packed with adventure stories about fearless explorers conquering unknown lands. Movies still portray men like Fawcett as romantic heroes facing mysterious dangers. But something is changing. Indigenous voices are speaking louder than ever before. Modern scholars are tearing down the myths. The comfortable lies about noble exploration are crumbling under the weight of truth. In the Amazon today, indigenous communities across the region continue to resist illegal miners, loggers, and treasure hunters, and still face disease and displacement. The colonial violence that killed Fawcett never ended. It just found new forms. The same extractive logic that drove 19th century treasure hunters now motivates modern, corporate, and illegal actors who strip resources from indigenous territories with the same disregard for human costs. Modern treasure hunters still follow in Fawcett's footsteps, bringing continued disruption to indigenous lands. Adventure tourists pay thousands of dollars to search for lost cities in protected territories. Illegal gold miners use mercury that poisons entire river systems. Artifact hunters strip sacred sites of their cultural treasures. Social media influencers turn indigenous suffering into content for their followers. Each expedition carries the same colonial arrogance that doomed Fawcett's team. Each invasion brings more death to communities that have already lost too much. The romanticization of explorers like Fawcett serves a darker purpose. It justifies ongoing extraction and exploitation in the name of progress and discovery. Mining companies use explorer mythology to sell destructive projects as adventures. Logging operations frame deforestation as opening new frontiers. Oil companies portray pipeline construction as brave exploration of untapped resources. The same narrative that made Fawcett a hero now makes corporate destruction seem noble and necessary. But indigenous communities refuse to stay silent anymore. They are reclaiming their narratives and challenging the colonial frameworks that erased their perspectives from history. Indigenous peoples document their own stories of resistance against destructive development projects. They create films showing how their ancestors tried to save explorers from their own stupidity. Indigenous scholars write books that center their communities as the real heroes of these stories. They're not asking for permission to tell their truth. They're demanding that the world listen. Environmental destruction continues in the Amazon, driven by the same logic of extraction that motivated colonial treasure hunters. Large swaths of forest continue to be lost each year. The logic remains identical to Fawcett's era. Take what you want, ignore the consequences, call it progress. Species go extinct before scientists can study them. Rivers run red with mining pollution. Indigenous communities lose their homes to make room for cattle ranches and soy farms. Our continued fascination with explorer myths prevents us from confronting the ongoing costs of colonial systems. We celebrate adventure while ignoring genocide. We romanticize discovery while dismissing displacement. We cheer for brave explorers while remaining silent about the communities they destroyed. This willful blindness allows the violence to continue. Every myth we preserve about noble exploration enables another invasion of indigenous territory. Every romantic story about lost cities justifies another mining operation. The real treasure was never gold or lost cities. It was the indigenous knowledge and ecological wisdom that colonialism systematically destroyed. Indigenous peoples understood how to live in balance with the Amazon for thousands of years. They developed medicines from forest plants that could revolutionize healthcare. They created agricultural systems that enriched soil instead of depleting it. They built societies that thrived without destroying their environment. This knowledge could save our planet from climate disaster, but colonialism burned most of it along with the people who held it. The communities that survived colonial violence now hold the keys to our future. They know how to protect forests. They understand sustainable living. They remember what we forgot in our rush for treasure and fame. But instead of listening, we keep telling stories about brave explorers who died chasing empty dreams while destroying irreplaceable wisdom. Does the Fawcett myth still help us avoid looking at who benefits from extraction today? Tell us what you think in the comments. Because until we confront what these stories really represent, we remain trapped in the same destructive patterns. The real revelation isn't that Percy Fawcett was cursed. It's that we continue to celebrate a system built on greed and destruction, while calling it adventure and discovery. We romanticize explorers to obscure the systematic violence they unleashed. Every time we celebrate colonial explorers, we enable the systems that still destroy indigenous communities today. What does our fascination with these myths say about our willingness to confront uncomfortable truths? Listen to indigenous perspectives and recent scholarship. They offer the corrective to centuries of mythologizing. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you want more re-examinations of famous exploration myths, hit that like button and subscribe. Check the description for sources if you want to dig deeper into this story.